Hello, and welcome to our second virtual reading group extra for The Messiness of Progress, Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall and David Hume's Essays and Histories. I'm Christy Lynn Horpedahl, the assistant editor at Adam Smith Works, and I'm here with Dr. Shannon Chamberlain, who is leading the group. We have more background on the readings in the extra from the first VRG, so I'm going to move a little faster this time. In part 2 of Mantel's work, we get an occult history of Britain, Wolsey's fall, and some personal, but at least this time not physical, blows to Thomas Cromwell. In the Hume, we get insults for all womankind, one man's story about what historians should aspire to. Hello, Shannon. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Christy.
So we'll start with Hume. He was much better known in the past for his histories of England, and now seems better known for other works. What do you think about his history of England and his thoughts on what writing history as a deliberate activity should be?
I think it's interesting to me that maybe this isn't really your question, but it's interesting to me that he is better known for the philosophy now, because his histories became such bestsellers, and people, and I assume women, read them. And what's, he kind of, in the essay on the writing of history we read this week, he makes an argument that it's the most moral form. It's somewhere between philosophy, which doesn't give enough of the specifics for us, and so it's between philosophy and, I forget what the other poll was, but too many specifics, maybe, being too much stuck in the moment. History allows us to abstract a little bit and to think about things from a certain distance that isn't, available to the people in the moment. But one of the things that's really interesting to me, and what we've been talking about in the group a lot, is that you have to keep in mind when you're reading historical fiction in a way that you don't have to keep in mind when you're reading history, that the people you're sympathizing with, to use the 18th century term, the people whose eyes you're seeing things through, are experiencing this for the first time, and don't have your purchase on events. So that seems like two different registers of morality to me, in some sense. You can read history and have the distance that's maybe required, as Hume says, for moral judgment, but you somehow also have to keep in mind that the people in it don't have that view available to them. And so where your sympathies lie, I think, has to be dependent on the fact that you know that about them, that they don't know how things are going to turn out. And, I end up asking, well, what would I do in their circumstances if I had only their knowledge?
I think that's a good question that Mantel helps us think about more often. And I do think I was sympathetic to some of Hume's claim, and I think some of the other participants were too, and that you would hand a historical novel to a friend maybe before you would hand them David Hume's History of England. So there is something about what is going to at least entice your reader into learning something more about the time period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that you confront is that, as we also talked about in the group this last week, a lot of what we're experiencing when we experience historical fiction is invention, in some sense. It's probabilistic. I always wonder why Hume didn't write about history a little bit more like that. He's so engaged with probability that, I was expecting to find more of that account in his histories of England, but it seems more or less absent.
So you're bringing up this tension between the history as a record and history as a story, which is a little bit related to my next question. There's so many beautiful quotes in the Mantel, but one that you asked the reading group to think about was when Cardinal Wolsey tells Thomas Cromwell, "These are old stories, but some people still believe them." And there's a lot in that sentence, right? Does Wolsey believe them? Does he think Cromwell will believe them? what do you think Wolsey is trying to tell Cromwell when he says this to him?
I wonder if I think that Wolsey, as much as Cromwell understands about Wolsey, Wolsey also understands about Cromwell. And Wolsey seems to understand that the narrative going on in Cromwell's head is often, how much do people owe to Italian banks? And I think that Wolsey is reminding him in some ways that that's not how other people think about the world. This is a very Cromwellian perspective. And Thomas Cromwell, I don't want to say that, at least in Mantel's novel, that he's bad at that. But he can be so oriented towards the practical sometimes, the material of the world, that it's hard for him to grasp what other sort of frameworks people are working with. And just looking a little bit ahead to the next reading that we're doing, there's a moment like this in part 3, where he meets Anne Boleyn for the first time, and he goes back to his house, and the women of his household, with whom he's normally very engaged in some ways, keep asking him all of these questions that he does not seem to be able to answer. The one question that he ends up being able to answer is how much her dress cost. His little niece asks him that question, and he's able to cost it out, as he might say. But the others ask him questions that he doesn't seem to engage with on some level. Well, I hear she's a good dancer. He says, well, we didn't dance. And I think somebody else says, I hear she has good teeth. And he says, I'll let you know when she sinks them into me. So it's a really good encapsulation of the way that Cromwell kind of thinks about things. And Wolsey is reminding him that other people think about things in different ways. They're more engaged with myth and story. They're maybe not as oriented towards the material and the practical world as he is.
I'm reminded a little of the modern adage, politics isn't really about policy. I think if you hang around with policy wonks, sometimes you can start to think that what you see happening is driven by politics. But if you get closer to the policymaking process, you can see, oh, there's a lot going on that isn't about policy in politics. So I've been thinking about that a lot as we've been reading the Mantel as well. So I wasn't able to sneak Adam Smith into our last conversation, but I'm sneaking him in here because you and I are both familiar with Adam Smith's parable of the poor man's son who wastes his life and chance for happiness striving for wealth. Do you think Cromwell is a good example of the kind of person Smith is warning his readers about, and why or why not?
I think I'm not sure. So on one level, he does seem happy. And especially maybe before he gets involved in the power politics that he's really starting to get involved in as the novel goes on. He's a rich merchant. He seems to sort of glory in that. We've commented before in the group about how much sort of physical texture he brings to this world that he describes. He's always, pinching cloth between his fingers, and there's a certain sort of animalistic, pure enjoyment in that seems to me alien from Smith's account of the man who, thinks that he's going to be happy in the future, so he does all of those things. I wonder if his drug of choice, Cromwell, isn't money but politics. He seems to want power more than money just sticks to him, as Stephen Gardner says. But that doesn't seem hard for him, and it doesn't seem to it seems to involve the exercise of his capabilities, and this in a sort of, I don't know, working at the edge of your capacity sense, the money making for him. But the politics is more difficult for him. Wolsey, before he dies, keeps pointing out the ways that it's going to be difficult for him, and Cromwell keeps ignoring him. I think at first because he wants to save Wolsey's life, and that's his original reason for getting into politics. But then he seems to acquire a taste for it. He likes this access to power. He likes the fact that he can please Henry, it seems, in ways that other people can't. Just even by having a conversation with him. And so I think that if we substitute money for politics, the metaphor of the poor man's son maps on better to Cromwell.
I will think more about that. I'm going to end today with a question inspired by Mantel's ending in part 2. The fancy name you gave this in our discussion was free indirect discourse. But for the less fancy people, she tells a story seemingly unrelated to the text that's not long, 20 lines, 300 words, and it's about Cicero and the invention of memory. You pointed out that Simonides, the inventor of memory, is identified in the story as a poet who has displeased his patron right before this invention. So what, if anything, do you think is significant about this ending section to part 2 and what Mantel's trying to open up to us as her readers in thinking about this example?
So the question that you originally asked me, Christy, is, so the story goes like this. Simonides is a poet. He's invited to give an address at a big banquet for some sort of lord. He gives an address on Castor and Pollux. He delivers a poem on Castor and Pollux, the Roman twins, the gods. And the patron doesn't like it. He said, well, you know, I'm only sort of getting half. I paid for one and you crammed both of these guys into this address. I don't like it. And so he's only going to pay him half of his original fee. And somebody comes to get Simonides during the banquet and says, there's 2 young men waiting for you outside. And so he goes out to find the young men. He doesn't ever find the young men who are waiting for him. But in the meantime, the banquet hall collapses, killing everybody inside. And Simonides is described as a remarkable man. The way that his remarkability manifests itself here is that he can name where everybody was sitting. And that's how the remains are identified and how the families are able to bury the dead. And Christy asked me whether I thought that the twins were meant to be Castor and Pollux, rewarding Simonides for giving them an ode. And I think the interesting thing about that is that the story suggests that interpretation just by the juxtaposition, but it never interprets it for us. It never says these are Castor and Pollux. We put our interpretation on that. And I think that what Mantel is drawing our attention to is that we do put our interpretation on stories like this. These could just be a random series of events that have nothing to do with each other at all. But it's poetry, and it's the poet who kind of makes sense of events for us. And I kind of wondered if that's what she was talking about herself. Is she the one who's putting this particular interpretation of events on the events that she's describing? And we've talked about all the ways that Wolf Hall is a major revisionary work, a kind of secret history even that says, well, you know, here's the story that you usually get about Thomas Cromwell, who is just this, you know, Henry VIII butcher, killed Thomas More, and you know, the typical story. But Mantel is helping us see this in a different way. And that might be the role of the poet over the historian. The historian's job is to give us the facts. The poet's job might be to make sense of them for us.
Well, that'll give us a lot to think about until our next discussion. Thank you. This conversation is in part inspired by a virtual reading group hosted by Liberty Fund. Thank you for watching. We hope you'll join us at a future reading group. You can find links to the virtual reading group pages and other related VRG extras in the video notes. Thanks again, Shannon, for being here today.
Thanks, Christy.